"You don't belong here!" the police officer roared, brutally shoving the woman's face onto the scorching stone steps of her own home. He sneered, his thumb subtly flicking off the body camera on his chest. A chillingly practiced move from someone accustomed to wielding power to trample truth in the shadows. But that arrogant smile vanished in the interrogation room when cold handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The suspect woman emerged from the shadows, not to confess, but to deliver judgment. She was the Chief Justice of the federal court, presiding over a purge aimed directly at his police department. From a wrongful arrest fueled by racial bias, the velvet curtain was torn open, exposing secret video footage and a blood-soaked past between two fathers, proving that justice may be delayed, but the retribution will always be brutal. Will the police badge still serve as a shield for crime? Or is this the opening shot of Project Rise, a war that will shake the entire nation? If the person pinned down on their own doorstep was your mother, would you stay silent or rise up? Comment below, and watch the full video to witness the moment the abuser of power pays the ultimate price. Under the scorching midday sun, the Bellevue Ridge neighborhood sat still like an over-polished photograph. Harsh white light glaring down on the stone steps leading to house number 28, making everything shine with a sterile brightness. To an outsider, it might look like a place where everything was clean, orderly, and properly upper class. But anyone who'd lived long enough in the American South knew that wealthy neighborhoods weren't heaven. They were thick layers of polish, covering up suspicious glances and silent questions that people of color had been hearing their whole lives, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. Elise Morgan understood that better than anyone. Her childhood wasn't spent in a 100-square-meter home, but in a damp, working-class neighborhood where her father was once held during a random police check and never came back. That loss etched a hardened fear into her, but it also sparked the determination she carried all the way through her rise to becoming one of the rare black women to serve as a federal judge. She knew she had climbed out of the place that had swallowed her family. But the old prejudice clung to her like a shadow, and this morning, it stood waiting right at her front door. Elise had only meant to step out onto the porch to retrieve a misdelivered folder before preparing for an important meeting. It was a simple action, one she'd done for years. The door creaked open, hot air gusted in, and the sunlight from the living room spilled across the white floor, casting a peaceful glow. There was no reason to think one simple step would trigger trouble, but in neighborhoods like this, trouble didn't need a reason. All it needed was a look, and that look arrived the moment Elise stood upright. Meredith White, who lived 2 houses down, was standing in her yard with a face full of disapproval, not the kind you give to strangers, but the kind reserved for someone who, in your mind, simply does not belong. Her eyes lingered for several seconds, just long enough for Elise to feel the cold judgment crawl across her skin like a blade with no edge. Meredith looked her up and down, then turned slightly, as if trying to convince herself that what she was seeing was out of place. A black woman stepping out of a 2-story, multi-million-dollar home, calm, natural, not holding a toolbox or wearing a maid's uniform. To Meredith, that alone was wrong, by the warped logic she had always believed was right. Elise picked up the file, turned to go back inside, but the sharp sting of being watched caught her at the back of the neck and made her pause for half a second. It wasn't fear, it was the alertness she'd learned long ago, the reflex of someone who grew up in a country where skin color was a silent accusation. She said nothing. She didn't look back. She knew people like Meredith didn't want explanations. They preferred stories built from their own imagination. Meredith kept watching, her lips pressed tight as she'd just spotted something serious. She stepped back slightly into the shade, lifted her phone, and shielded it with her sleeve. Elise couldn't hear the exact words, but her instincts told her Meredith was calling no one but 911, because women like her didn't talk to neighbors. They called the police, whenever something made them feel off. Meredith had done the same to her own gardener. The poor man had been trimming hedges behind the fence for nearly 10 years, and just because he wore a new shirt and stood up straighter one day, Meredith called 911 and reported it as a break-in. Elise had seen it all before. She didn't need to hear to know what was coming. Hot wind swept down the street, the trees standing silently like they'd seen this habit 100 times, the habit of people who believed in the entitlement of whiteness. Meredith leaned against a porch column, pressing her phone to her ear with a short, firm voice full of meaning. Elise didn't have to guess. She knew the content of that call would read like an indictment. A black woman standing outside someone's house, looking out of place. Just a few words like that in Bellevue Ridge were enough to send a patrol car flying in, ready for violence. Elise stood under a beam of sunlight shining straight down from the porch roof. And for a few seconds, everything around her felt frozen, because she knew exactly what would follow that call. People like Meredith never needed proof. They only needed a feeling. And in this place, the feeling of one wealthy white woman could turn the existence of a black woman into a threat. Elise took a long, slow breath, hand resting on the doorframe as if to steady her heartbeat. She was used to contempt disguised as civility, but today's stare wasn't the usual quiet hostility. It was an open accusation from someone who believed that if she felt something was wrong, the whole system would agree. Elise stepped back inside, but the tightness in her chest didn't ease. She knew a storm was coming, and this time, it wouldn't stop at just a look. Meredith pressed the phone tightly to her ear like she was reporting a real emergency, her voice ringing out clearly. Every word sharp, with the confidence of someone who always assumes they're right. "There's a black woman standing at someone's front door," she said bluntly, without hesitation, as if skin color alone was enough to turn Elise into a threat. Then came the next line, sharp and poisonous like a needle to the chest. She might be armed. In neighborhoods like Bellevue Ridge, that sentence was a fuse. It planted in the dispatcher's mind the image of an armed standoff, even though all that was really happening was a woman stepping outside to retrieve a file. Elise stood inside the porch, not hearing every word, but recognizing Meredith's urgent, spiteful tone, the same tone she'd once used with the gardener, the same tone that made police rush in, as if they were rescuing the neighborhood from danger. The dispatcher logged the report, checked the address, and when he heard "possibly armed," both his voice and his process shifted. The priority level was immediately raised. A black suspect, reportedly standing at the door of a wealthy home and possibly carrying a weapon, was all the system needed to respond in the most dangerous way possible. Elise was still there, not yet fully back inside, when Meredith ended the call. The neighborhood held its breath for a few seconds. Then Elise felt it, that chill along her spine. The one she'd known since childhood. Every time she heard of another black person misunderstood and turned into a target. She set the file folder on the small table near the door and looked outside, reminding herself to stay calm. The hot wind moved past, leaves brushing together in near silence, so quiet that Elise thought Meredith might have moved on, but her lived experience told her otherwise. Once Meredith picked up the phone, things were already out of her hands. Elise had no idea the system had now labeled her as an armed suspect, all because of the way Meredith had described her. And once that label was recorded, the officers driving in weren't coming to ask questions. They were arriving ready to pin someone to the ground. The air outside her door thickened, time tightening into the few dozen seconds between the call and the system's reaction. Elise stood still for a moment, listening for any sound beyond the sunlight hitting the pavement. She knew that some moments in life come without warning, but change everything, and this one smelled like trouble. Meredith turned away, her figure retreating into her porch with a strange sense of satisfaction, as if her task was complete. From the far end of the street, A familiar sound rose, the roar of a large engine, the grind of tires on the smooth road of an upper-class neighborhood. Elise squinted into the distance and saw the white and blue patrol car make a sharp turn onto the main road leading into Bellevue Ridge. The way the car swerved said everything. Not slow, not cautious. It moved like it was chasing a suspect who had just fled the scene. Dust kicked up from the front bumper, and sunlight bounced off the hood, making the whole car look like a block of metal hurtling toward its target. Elise held the edge of the door lightly, tilting her head, the unease plain in the way she tapped her fingers on the wooden frame. She had seen scenes like this on the news, police storming black neighborhoods with an attitude totally different from how they approached white ones. But today, she was standing in one of the white neighborhoods, and they were still coming at the speed of a major takedown. The patrol car didn't slow until it was just a few meters from her house. Then it slammed to a stop. The screech of tires tore through the fake calm of the entire block. Meredith poked her head out of her porch, said something to the person inside, her voice low but seemingly satisfied. Elise stood up straight, hands gently clenched at her sides. She knew she'd done nothing wrong. But life had taught her that doing nothing wrong has never been enough to keep a black person safe. The moment the car screeched to a halt in front of her house, Elise felt the storm arrive. She couldn't see the officer's face through the sun-glared windshield, but the way the car had stopped told her the person inside wasn't here for a polite chat. The door swung open hard, and the slam echoed down the street, a signal that authority had arrived, and whoever got called out now had no choice but to stand still and accept whatever fate was about to be handed down. Elise glanced at Meredith. Her neighbor's eyes glinted with something close to satisfaction, like she'd struck a match and was now watching the fire spread. Elise took a deep breath, bracing for what she knew she didn't deserve, but had learned long ago not to be surprised by. The officer stepped out, his posture and pace toward Elise, speaking one simple truth. In his eyes, Meredith's words were all he needed to believe Elise was a threat. The patrol car screeched like a hunting beast, spotting its prey. And that was the moment Elise knew. The spiral of injustice had begun. The car door slammed shut, and Elise saw the man step out, with the kind of walk that suggested he believed the entire street was under his command. Vincent Hale was tall, broad-shouldered. His shoes hit the pavement with a heavy, dry thud, the stride of someone convinced he's always right. His eyes swept over Elise once, then settled on her with a cold stare, like he was brushing trash off the curb. He hadn't said a word, yet Elise already knew exactly what kind of man was walking toward her. The kind of officer who saw black people as a nuisance, a burden, a default criminal. He didn't look at her as a resident, but as someone who didn't belong. Elise stood tall, steady gaze, refusing to drop her eyes, even though she knew that look had made many people tremble in fear. Vincent stopped a few steps from the porch, chin tilted slightly upward, his hand resting near his holster like the order to shoot had been issued before he even got out of the car. He didn't assess the situation, didn't ask anyone in the neighborhood what was going on. His voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Step away from the door, lady. This is not your house." The sentence came out fast, firm, practiced like he'd said it 1,000 times every time he saw a black person near expensive property. He spoke without asking, without observing, not even giving Elise a second to respond. Elise met his eyes and replied, her voice calm, in stark contrast to his aggression. "Officer, this is my home." Each word was slow, clear, like someone simply stating a fact. She didn't step back, because whether she did or didn't wouldn't change anything. A man like Vincent had already decided who she was the moment he saw her. Elise kept her tone level, not escalating the tension, but not bowing to the insult either. Vincent let out a short, dry laugh, like a rusted metal door creaking open. He looked at Elise for a moment, then squinted with mockery. "Sure. And I'm the president." His half-smile said more than his words in his mind. There was no way a black woman could walk out of a house like this without something shady going on. It wasn't a joke. It was the affirmation of a man who believed his bias to be the absolute truth. To Elise, it felt like a cold blade sliding across skin, not painful yet, but sharply uncomfortable. Elise took a breath, ready to speak again. "My name is—" But Vincent cut her off before she could finish. "I don't need your name," he barked, voice rising a notch. "I need you to step back and stop lying." Those two words, "stop lying," came out like a verdict. No evidence needed. Elise stood there, one hand lightly touching the edge of the door. Her eyes still locked on his, though a slight tremble had started in her chest. Not from fear of him, but fear of his mindset. She'd seen too many like him cause tragedies before the accused could say half a sentence. Meredith was still somewhere on her porch, quietly watching. Her mouth pursed the way people do when they're waiting for the drama to unfold. Elise knew someone like Meredith wouldn't feel guilt watching this. She'd feel validated. Elise didn't look her way, keeping her focus on Vincent, trying to hold on to control, at least of what was still hers. "I live here," Elise repeated, her voice lower this time to stay composed, hoping he might hear even a sliver of the truth. Vincent raised his eyebrows and curled his lips into a mocking smile. "Yeah, you keep saying that." His voice was no longer just angry. It carried the sneer of someone convinced he was exposing her words as lies. Elise could hear the contempt laced in every syllable he threw out, the kind of tone officers used when they wanted to assert power over anyone they deemed beneath them. The irritation under her skin flared into heat, but Elise stayed composed. She was used to this kind of direct insult. It had followed her all her life. She tried once more, her voice gentle but clear. "If you scan the—" But before she could finish, Vincent raised his hand to cut her off. His arm sliced through the space between them, like a barrier forbidding her from speaking. "I told you to stop." His voice was flat, final, stripped of all doubt. Elise paused for half a second, feeling as if she had been shoved out of her own doorway, even though she was standing exactly where she belonged. Vincent looked at her again, but his gaze wasn't searching for facts. It was hunting for flaws. To him, Elise's presence in this neighborhood was already a flaw. In that moment, Elise knew that everything she said would be treated as an excuse. She had the truth, but the man in front of her didn't care. Vincent stepped forward half a pace, his hand closer to his holster now, his eyes tight and sharp with warning. Elise swallowed the lump rising in her throat, not out of fear, but from the naked humiliation she had to stand there and take. She softened her tone again and said, "Officer Hale, if you give me 10 seconds, I can—" But again, she couldn't finish. Vincent cut her off with a cold snap. "Lady, cut it out." His voice dropped heavy into the thick heat, like a blade slicing straight through her pride. Elise didn't move. She didn't step back or forward. She held on to the last thread of calm, just enough to keep the situation from spiraling further. She understood this had nothing to do with any suspicious act. It was about who he had already decided she was. Vincent took a breath, his eyes fixed on hers with brute force. Elise lifted her chin slightly. Her next words came quietly but steadily. "You're making a mistake." Vincent narrowed his eyes, his mouth curling into a cruel smile. "We'll see about that." The word snapped shut like a lock, marking the moment Elise knew the storm was no longer waiting outside. It was right in front of her now, ready to drag her in the most vicious way prejudice knew how. Vincent stepped half a pace closer, his shadow spilling over the porch steps, as if to force Elise backward, though she didn't move an inch. Sunlight blazed down on the pavement, making everything glare except his face, which darkened with the kind of threat familiar to men used to overpowering others by barking orders. He raised his arm straight out, index finger pointing directly at Elise's face like he was pointing at a criminal. "Hands up!" he barked, his voice sharp and clipped. "Don't make me get rough. I know you're kind." Each word landed like a stone, thrown directly at her, the hatred in his tone completely exposed, not even pretending to be professional. Elise stayed where she was, drawing in a breath so she wouldn't get pulled into his aggression. She knew he was projecting everything onto her, just because she was standing outside her own house. In Hale's eyes, there was no doubt, no effort to assess just an old prejudice, the kind that made him see her not as a neighbor, but as someone who deserved to be shouted at and controlled. Vincent's eyes flicked quickly across the front yard, the white wall of the house behind Elise, then came back to her face. He hadn't asked for any ID. He hadn't checked the license plate of the car in the garage, still half open. He hadn't asked her name. Hadn't asked why she was standing on her own porch. He showed up and decided Elise was the problem. "Police need your cooperation," he said, but his tone sounded more like an order to a convict. Elise kept her voice calm but firm. "Officer, please scan the door. The ID code is in the system. I live here." She spoke every word clearly, hoping he would hear even a fragment of the truth. But Vincent frowned, like her words only irritated him more. He leaned in toward her, his left hand dropping hard onto the holster at his side. The thud was dry and heavy, tightening the air around the porch like a vice. "I said shut up," he snapped, louder and sharper this time. "You didn't hear me?" Elise hesitated, not because she was afraid of the gun, but because of how absurd his behavior had become. She understood exactly where she was standing, the situation she was in, and most of all, the type of man Vincent represented. The kind who believes he has the right to stop anyone he wants. The kind who thinks his voice is louder than any truth. Elise glanced briefly at his hand, resting on the holster, then back to his eyes. "I just need you to check for 1 second," she said, her voice low and slow, careful not to spark him further. "My door has a verification system. It'll only take a moment. Resin place." As soon as she finished speaking, Vincent let out a dry, mocking laugh, then suddenly held out his hand, palm toward her, like giving a command to a dog. "I don't need you to tell me how to do my job," he said, voice thick with contempt. Elise felt every word he spoke was designed to dig into her, to remind her that in his eyes, she had no right to speak on equal footing. "Stand still. Don't say another word," he repeated, now almost shouting. Elise gently pressed her fingers together to hold on to her calm. She knew exactly what kind of man stood in front of her, and she knew that the smallest misstep could send everything spiraling. As she adjusted her breath, her eyes briefly dropped to his chest. A tiny red light on his body cam flickered on, then went dark all in the span of a single second. And that 1 second was enough for Elise to understand. He had just deliberately turned the camera off. It was a dangerous habit, one Elise had heard about from hundreds of other victims in cases of police misconduct. A small move with a heavy meaning. If he turned it off, it meant he didn't want anyone to see what he was about to do. It meant he believed he'd never be held accountable. It meant he had already written a story in his mind, and the truth was not part of it. Elise stared him in the face without another word. She felt the tension settle between them like a thin sheet of glass, ready to shatter at any moment. She didn't raise her hands as he ordered, but she didn't make any move that could be seen as defiance either. Vincent took another step closer, eyes scanning her coldly, as if checking for any dangerous signs. He wasn't looking for facts. He was looking for faults. Elise didn't respond anymore because she knew the more she spoke, the more he would take that as an excuse to tighten control. Her heartbeat stayed steady, but the weight of frustration started rising like a thin smoke in her throat. She pushed it down, holding on to the last bit of dignity the situation hadn't stripped away. Vincent glanced across the lawn, then back toward the door. then turned to Elise with a look of disgust, as if her standing there was something offensive that he had to clean up. "Good," he said, short and flat. "Now, stay right there. It's tracks." Elise swallowed quietly. No nod, no shake of the head, just looked at him in silence. That silence wasn't surrender. It was protection. The heat still wrapped the porch, but what she really felt was the growing threat in the air. Elise understood that from the moment Vincent switched off his body cam, she was no longer facing a police officer. She was facing a man who believed his authority gave him the power to rewrite the truth. And she knew that to protect herself, she had to suppress every feeling rising inside her, even the shame that now sat heavily on her chest. Vincent didn't wait for Elise to say another word. He lunged forward, fast and rough, as if she had personally insulted him in some past life. His hand clamped down on her wrist with such force that Elise heard a faint crack from the joint. Before she could react, her wrist was twisted sharply behind her back. A deliberate, practiced move that looked exactly like the arrest videos Elise had seen of mistaken identities. Her skin burned under the pressure of his grip. Her breath caught off rhythm for a split second. But Elise didn't struggle, partly because of the pain, and partly because she knew that in Vincent's eyes, any reaction could become the evidence he wanted. He yanked her arm behind her and shoved hard. The force jerked her shoulder backward, her muscles tensed in reflex, throwing Elise off balance. She missed a step on the porch, and that's when Vincent used her stumble to bring her down. He wrenched her wrist again, swept his leg into hers, and the takedown came so fast, Elise only saw the blinding sky for a flash before the stone floor slammed into her body. The impact rang out, sharp and heavy, reverberating down her spine like a jolt of electricity. Her elbow scraped along the burning hot tile, leaving behind a red streak that glared under the sun. Elise clenched her teeth as the pain sliced through her like a blade, but she made no sound. The heat from the ground seared her cheek, making her vision blur, but she kept her breathing as steady as possible. Vincent drove his knee into her back to secure her in place, then yanked her arm higher than necessary, pain radiating all the way to her shoulder blade. Elise inhaled sharply, her breath ragged but silent. She knew even a single cry could be twisted into proof that she was resisting, and she knew there were people who never stood up again simply because they opened their mouths when it hurt. She heard Vincent's boots shift near her head. His voice rose, loud enough for neighbors to hear. "Resisting arrest," he barked. "You all saw it." He turned toward Meredith, adding a touch of smugness to his tone. "Told you. People like this always cause trouble." Meredith stood on her porch, arms crossed, nodding like she was confirming his every word. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as she'd just seen her long-held assumptions about Elise proven right. Elise could feel every grain of dust pressed to her face, the heat rising higher, but she kept her eyes focused on the door to her house, just a few feet away, using it as a quiet anchor to stay calm. Even the breeze did nothing to cool the sting on her elbow. Vincent leaned down by her ear, his voice lower now, but sharper. "You think I believe that story about this being your house? You're on someone else's porch, and you've got the nerve to argue." Elise closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them slowly, letting no word slip that he could turn into a weapon. He tightened his grip, pushing harder like he was trying to force a confession from someone who had done nothing wrong. "I warned you," he said, harsher now. "You brought this on yourself." Elise felt her wrist on the verge of dislocating, her hand going numb, but she locked the feeling away with a steady exhale, soft, firm, unshaken. She gave him nothing he could twist into guilt. A few other residents had started peeking out from behind their doors, eyes curious, but avoiding direct contact with Elise, as if afraid to be pulled into the trouble. Someone lifted a phone, but they were too far to capture anything clearly. Vincent noticed and raised his voice even more. She tried to run, I had to stop her. Everyone saw it. Elise turned her eyes sideways toward Vincent, no raised brows, no words, just a look full of things he could never understand. Beneath her silence wasn't surrender, but a message unspoken. She would not let him turn this story into his version. That look made Vincent falter for half a second, but he quickly dismissed it. In his mind, power always outweighed truth. The pain from her elbow spread up her arm and across her shoulder. A sharp, throbbing pulse Elise felt in waves, but her face stayed composed. Sweat trickled down her temple from heat, not fear. She didn't turn her head to seek help from anyone nearby, because she knew this wasn't the kind of place where people stood up for someone being seen through only one lens. Vincent pushed his knee down harder, as if to declare that his control was absolute. That pressure anchored Elise to the stone steps, but it didn't break her spirit. She drew in a deep breath, then raised her eyes slightly, looking forward. Under the blistering sun, her gaze held no rage, only the steady steel of someone who knew life had already put her through enough to understand this moment wouldn't define who she was, but it would define what came next for the man holding her down. Her eyes locked on the space ahead, seeming to pierce through the glare toward something farther, a silent promise. In them was a strange calm, cold but clear, not resistance, but not surrender, a look that told her she would return, not for revenge, but to uncover the truth Vincent was trying to bury under brute force. And in that moment, on the sunlit steps streaked with blood, Elise understood the real battle hadn't even begun. Meredith stood right at the edge of her porch, arms folded across her chest, like someone watching a performance she believed she had directed from the start. She nodded in satisfaction, her eyes squinting as she watched Elise being forced down onto the steps. "I knew it," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, her voice as sour as vinegar. That sentence wasn't about behavior, wasn't about circumstance. It was a direct attack on Elise's identity. The kind people like Meredith always make, turning a black person's very presence into something inherently wrong. Elise heard the words like hearing the long history of being diminished all over again. But she stayed silent, knowing that at this moment, any word she said could be turned into a weapon against her. Doors along the street slowly cracked open. 3 homes across the way lit up their porch lights, the homeowners standing behind glass panels, peering out. 2 young men on the corner raised their phones to record. But Elise noticed they weren't filming the full scene. They were deliberately choosing angles that made her look like someone kneeling in guilt. Their frames didn't capture Vincent twisting her arm. They didn't capture him shutting off the body cam. They didn't show Meredith's smug satisfaction. None of the context. Just the image of a black woman being subdued by a white officer. And that alone was enough to create a one-sided story. A man in workout clothes, standing at a distance, called over to a neighbor. Good thing someone called the cops in time. These days, who knows what they'll do? His voice carried the tone of casual disdain. Like suspicion was the most reasonable reaction. A woman nearby whispered to someone next to her, "You can just tell by the way she looks." Just one sentence, but Elise heard it clearly, and it struck an old wound in her chest. All the comments, all the stares, all the phones recording, they gathered into a thick air of class and racial division that Elise had spent her entire life trying to escape. Vincent was still on the steps, looking down at Elise as if she were a burden that needed to be removed from the neighborhood. Elise tried to steady her breathing. Pain in her elbow made her arm tremble slightly. But she still held her head high, trying to keep her natural composure. Her gaze swept across the people recording, then settled on Meredith. That look, calm, steady, made Meredith take a small step back, as if she'd seen something in Elise's eyes that unsettled her. In a voice strained to avoid being misinterpreted, Elise spoke softly. "If you let me get my identification, you'll see it clearly." Her voice was slightly hoarse from the rough handling and the effort of holding herself together. "I live here." It wasn't a plea, it was the only reasonable offer left. But Elise already knew, almost certainly, that Vincent wouldn't care. Still, she tried, because unlike him, she still believed in logic and truth. Vincent spun around, his face tightening like a stretched wire. He let out a short, smug laugh, as if Elise had just told a joke. He leaned down close to her face, voice sharp and cold like a hammer hitting steel. "Identification?" he said, eyes full of contempt. "Someone like you owning a house here?" He flicked his hand as if swatting away a fly, then raised his voice so everyone watching could hear clearly. "This neighborhood is not for people like her." His shouted words hit Elise in the face. Not like a personal insult, but like the voice of an entire system determined to keep people like her outside its borders. Vincent stepped back half a pace, so everyone could get a clearer view of Elise pinned to the ground. He wanted the rest of the neighborhood to look on and nod in agreement that everything made sense. Elise saw the way he changed his tone when speaking in front of the neighbors he was performing for their approval, seeking validation for what he was doing. An elderly woman from the house to the left murmured something like, "Who knows what she was trying to do?" then nodded to the person beside her, as if she had just confirmed her own suspicion. The whole street seemed to settle into a shared sense of quiet contempt, the kind not spoken aloud, but passed through glances, small nods, and a biased video clip. Elise lay there, feeling every look like a needle in her back. But those very looks also showed her the true face of the place she had once tried to believe was safe. Vincent stood on the porch step, one hand near his holster, the other gripping her wrist tight. "Cut the act," he said loudly, like she was putting on a show. "You're making this worse." Elise felt each word land cold and heavy. She kept her eyes forward, not lowering her gaze, not flinching. She knew that if her eyes so much as flickered, he would use it to back up the story he was building. Through the pain radiating from her wrist to her shoulder, Elise let out a faint smile so slight that no one would notice unless they were close. It wasn't mockery, nor surrender. It was the kind of smile that comes when someone sees something inevitable. The blind arrogance of Vincent and Meredith. That smile made Vincent frown for a split second, as he had just witnessed something he couldn't make sense of. In those brief seconds, Elise said nothing more. She let the smile linger like a silent message that she knew exactly where she truly belonged, and she knew what was happening wouldn't end with Vincent's last word. She hadn't been diminished. She hadn't broken. She simply held on to a small piece of dignity, reminding herself that what was unfolding would, eventually, be seen for what it really was. That faint smile, in the chaos of humiliation, was what ensured this moment wouldn't be the end, but the start of a far greater storm. The doorbell camera at Elise's front door was still lit. The small lens mounted beside the frame had begun recording the moment she stepped out onto the porch. It had been installed to deter theft and track deliveries, but this afternoon it became a silent witness to a chain of actions Vincent Hale believed he had hidden through years of routine. The moment he leaned down to disable his body cam, a motion quick and almost reflexive, the doorbell camera caught every move. From its angle near the door, it captured him reaching for the device on his chest, glancing side to side, then pressing the button to turn off the indicator light. The red light on the body cam blinked out, but the door camera's lens hovered in frame, like a second eye that never blinked. Across the street, the security camera on the porch of a young couple's home was also rolling. That wider angle captured the full set of stairs and part of the walkway where Vincent forced Elise down. In the footage, Elise's frame looked small beneath Vincent's larger body, as his hand clamped around her wrist, shoving her down against the stone. A violent jerk sent her collapsing. Two cameras, capturing the same moment from two different angles, one close, one wide, pieced together a story Vincent could not twist. As Elise went down, her elbow slid across the stone surface. A thin red line trailed after it like a thread. That streak, by chance, landed right in the focal zone of the door camera. The sunlight made it stand out on the pale surface, clear enough that each drop was visible when zoomed in. That image was cold and undeniable, enough for a single glance to reveal the force that had been used. Elise lay there, pain radiating through her shoulder with each heartbeat, unaware that above her head, the camera was documenting every second. She knew she was being treated unfairly, knew Vincent was fabricating a narrative, knew Meredith was watching with smug satisfaction. But she had no idea that the evidence was quietly stacking up behind them, layer by layer, silent yet powerful. The view from the opposite camera clearly showed Vincent scanning his surroundings before loudly announcing, "Resisting arrest. You all saw it." In that shot, Elise lay still, not moving, offering no resistance, making his statement jarringly false. It was that contrast that made the footage undeniable. Every word he spoke landed like a recorded confession of his misconduct. The doorbell camera also caught something Vincent never considered. Elise's eyes, as she looked up after being slammed down. Eyes quiet, but strong, carrying the weight of being humiliated without allowing herself to break. That look, framed clearly, was a reminder that the victim had not surrendered to power, and it clashed completely with Vincent's shouted commands above her. Out on the road, a resident's car passed by, and its dashcam recorded a few seconds as it turned into the side street. That footage showed Vincent blocking Elise, and the force of his hand pressing down. It was a third angle farther away, but it helped complete the picture. 3 angles, 3 pieces of evidence, 3 overlapping stories that needed no further explanation. Elise gritted her teeth to endure, never once turning toward the camera. She didn't know it was on, didn't know that each second was being saved to memory. All her endurance came from the belief that she might need to recount every detail if taken to the station. But the camera was doing that for her coldly, but precisely. Meredith still stood with her arms crossed, watching, occasionally glancing at Elise's porch camera, not realizing it was recording. She only cared about how Elise looked in front of the neighbors like someone caught doing wrong. But on the footage, she stood clearly in frame, watching intently, not as a concerned neighbor, but as an active witness. A boy from across the street peeked out from his window, secretly recording part of the scene on his phone. In the blurry frame, his mother's voice faintly echoed, "Don't stand near the door, that's their business." But the boy's phone kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Vincent pressing Elise's back harder than necessary. The truth doesn't always speak. But this morning, it had 3 angles, 3 emotionless yet honest eyes, every detail from the flicked-off body cam, to the violent takedown, to the lie about her resisting, to the streak of blood on stone, all lived inside that footage. Each one a piece Vincent could not twist. On the steps, Elise inhaled slowly, trying to control her breath after the blow. She didn't know that everything Vincent was doing was being recorded. She only knew she was being subdued by someone who didn't see her as human. But in that moment, the lowest one, a very small signal, was blinking quietly. The evidence had begun to gather, in a way Vincent never anticipated. The storm he had started seemed to be dragging Elise down, but somewhere, just beyond the living room wall, the LED light on the doorbell camera kept blinking steadily, quietly continuing its work. And that small, sharp detail was enough to begin turning the entire story around. Vincent held Elise's wrist for one final beat, as if to assert his power before pulling her to her feet. His motion was rough and unrestrained, nearly knocking Elise off balance, but she managed to stay on her feet. He said nothing, just breathed heavily, like someone savoring the thrill of overpowering another person. Then he dragged her by the arm like hauling a sack, pushing her straight toward the patrol car parked in the driveway. The neighbors were still watching. A few phones were raised. A few heads ducked back under porches, but their eyes remained fixed. Elise moved where she was pulled, each step painful, but she kept her back straight, refusing to be dragged like someone guilty. As they neared the car, Vincent yanked her arm downward, flung the back door open, and shoved her inside. Her back hit the edge of the seat, knocking the wind from her lungs for a second. He leaned down and shoved her head in without the slightest care, then slammed the door so hard the sound echoed down the entire block. No explanation, no statement. Not one word follows the protocol. Elise leaned against the window, her hands cuffed behind her, the cold metal biting her skin, staring out through the dusty glass. In those few seconds, she felt like she'd been ripped from her rightful place and crammed into the role Vincent wanted to assign her. But that feeling didn't make her bow her head. Vincent got into the front seat, yanked the seatbelt like he was preparing for a pointless ride. He glanced at the rear-view mirror, his eyes locking onto Elise with a mix of contempt and pleasure. He turned the key, the engine screeched, and then he said in thick Southern accented English, each word stressed, so she wouldn't miss it. "The rich don't belong to people like you, Eastags." The words dropped softly, as if he were commenting on the weather. But the meaning was razor-sharp, cutting straight into her pride. Elise looked at him through the mirror, her gaze calm, steady. "You don't know who I am," she said slowly, her tone so neutral it made Vincent's brow twitch. She didn't yell. She didn't react. She spoke like stating a plain fact, and that made her words land harder than any protest. Vincent let out a laugh, short, dry, hollow, like wood knocking together. He shook his head and spat out, full of mockery. "I know enough. Just another problem, that's all." He said it like she was an old debt he had to settle, like she was made to be a burden. Elise didn't reply. She turned her face to the window, not to avoid him, but to hold on to a steady breath in the face of someone whose mind was closed tight. The car moved slowly down the road, past the oversized houses Elise had lived among for nearly 10 years. The shadows of trees reflected across the glass. Familiar rooftops slid by like a quiet wall. But there was no trace of belonging left in this moment. Elise looked at each house and realized the people on this street didn't see her as a neighbor. They saw her as an intruder, right inside her own life. Vincent checked the rearview mirror again, as if to see whether Elise had finally broken. He liked the feeling of watching someone shrink beneath his power. But Elise stared directly into his eyes through the mirror. No flinch, no blink. Her gaze didn't say, "I'm scared," or "I give up." It said, "You're speaking to someone you don't understand." That alone made Vincent uneasy for a beat. He looked away quickly, as if he didn't want to risk being figured out. The car turned out of the neighborhood, the small screen on the dashboard displaying the route to the station. Elise closed her eyes for a moment to regulate her breath. She knew she was being humiliated. She knew Vincent didn't see her as a person. But deep beneath the pain in her wrists, her shoulders, her back, was a steady, calm like bedrock under a raging current. Vincent looked at her with the eyes of a victor. But he didn't realize he was trying to crush someone who had stood on the bench and sentenced men like him before. Elise opened her eyes and looked at Vincent once more through the mirror. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth lifted just enough to bother him if he saw it. It wasn't a smug grin. It was the smile of someone who knew the truth would arrive on time. Vincent glanced at the mirror, caught that smile, and frowned, then turned away. Something in Elise's expression unsettled him, as she had just told him with her eyes, "This isn't over." The air in the car thickened, but inside that weight, Elise held firm. Vincent's words had brushed past her like dust. Her eyes stayed calm, like she was already standing in another place, a place Vincent couldn't imagine. A place where, in just a few hours, he would be stunned by the truth. Inside the police station, the air always carried the smell of old printer paper, sweat left behind on shift chairs, and the familiar scent of power held by those who believed every story would be written the way they chose. Vincent dragged Elise in, with a hand still dusty from the pavement, opened the interrogation room door, and shoved her inside. She stumbled but caught herself, sitting down on the metal chair still warm from whoever had just left. The door slammed shut, the turning of the lock echoing sharply and coldly. Out in the hallway, Vincent changed his tone, like an actor shifting scenes. He stood at the desk, turned on the computer, and typed quickly with the confidence of someone who had written the script before even arriving on site. He opened the report form and started typing. Suspect approached another person's home in a suspicious manner. Next line. Suspect failed to comply when asked to leave the area. Then the third. Displayed minor resistance during the arrest. Each word flowed smoothly, as if copied from hundreds of other reports, the kind he and people like him used as shields to protect themselves. Vincent added a closing note. Situation showed potential for escalation due to suspect's confrontational attitude. He typed the word confrontational with pleasure, as if logging a victory in a battle he had crowned himself the winner of. After reviewing the report, he leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Everything was where he wanted it, and he believed the report was enough to sway anyone reading it to his side. Inside the interrogation room, Elise sat still, hands resting on the table. Her wrists throbbed with pain, but she kept her breathing steady. The white light from the ceiling bulb cast a cold circle across the metal surface, but Elise refused to let it shake her focus. She had sat in rooms like this before, but on the other side, as the one asking questions, analyzing, passing judgment. Today, she sat there with swollen hands, but her eyes showed nothing but calm understanding. She knew Vincent was fabricating a narrative, and she knew men like him believed a report was an unchallengeable truth. Not far from the room was the main work area. A young officer named Jace, new to the force, was copying the log from the previous shift. He heard Vincent laughing to himself while reviewing the report and glanced up, curious. Vincent wasn't speaking quietly. His voice was loud, like he wanted to be overheard. "I handled her real quick," he boasted to a passing colleague. "Those types, let 'em talk too long. They start blaming people, making a scene." He let out a laugh, short and hollow. Jace shot him a look, then pretended to focus back on his notebook. As he wrote, he heard Vincent continue. "I know how to deal with them. That kind, all talk, no sense. You've got to pin them down early, or they'll never stop." His tone was both smug and demeaning, the kind that sent a chill down Jace's spine. He had never liked Vincent's behavior, but today, that discomfort turned into real suspicion. Jace looked around and saw no one paying attention. He set his pen down, slipped a hand into his pocket, and took out his phone. He opened the voice recorder app and placed the phone in his desk drawer. Notebook still open to keep up the act. Vincent stood nearby, still bragging. She pushed back, so I slammed her. That kind always tries something. You have to be rough from the start. Every word made it into the recorder, clear and unfiltered. Jace didn't look directly at him, but occasionally tilted his ear to make sure the audio was picking up. He kept his breathing shallow, not wanting to disrupt the recording. Every sentence from Vincent was gold in the most painful sense. "I turned off the body cam to avoid the hassle," Vincent said with a chuckle. "Cases like this get real messy if they're on tape." That line froze Jace's hand. He tapped the screen lightly to confirm the file was still running. In his mind, the image of Vincent pinning Elise down on the porch, a moment he'd glimpsed as the patrol car brought her in, became sharper. He'd sensed something was wrong, but he hadn't expected this level of blunt cruelty. Jace swallowed hard, staring down at his notebook without reading a word. He wasn't someone who liked conflict with coworkers, but he also wasn't someone who could watch abuse of power in silence. He slid his phone further back into the drawer and turned off the screen, leaving it recording unnoticed. In the interrogation room, Elise looked up at the door, sensing the strange quiet outside. She didn't know Vincent was exposing himself just down the hall, didn't know Jace was recording it all. She only knew that in places like this, truth rarely stood with the arrested. But sometimes it was the ones watching from outside the story who became the first light. Jace stood from his desk, watching Vincent walk down the hall with that same smug look. In Jace's hand, the phone lay silent, but inside it lived a piece of the truth Vincent thought he had buried. And from that moment on, the story began to shift in a direction Vincent had never prepared for. Elise sat in the interrogation room, a white light shining straight down onto the metal table. The voice of the desk officer echoed faintly from beyond the door, like a distant hum. She had been sitting long enough to know that Vincent was stalling, trying to buy time, as if waiting to quietly reduce her to a minor case file before anyone had the chance to ask questions. Her wrist still throbbed with every pulse, but Elise kept her posture straight, both hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes fixed on the gray-painted metal door. When Vincent finally opened the door and stepped inside, he stood at the entrance with his hand on the doorframe like he owned the room. Elise looked at him calmly. "I need a phone call," she said, her voice soft but not low. "I need to contact my office." "It's Tudor's." Vincent raised his eyebrows in disbelief, then let out a dry laugh stuck in his throat. "Office?" he repeated. "Whose house are you cleaning that needs an office call?" He clicked his tongue, shook his head, and said with that obnoxious, swaggering tone, "Don't come in here acting fancy. You get one call, but don't play games." Elise's expression didn't change. She looked at him the way someone might examine something smaller than the insult itself. "I need to call," she repeated. "No more, no less." The calm in her tone irked Vincent. He was used to fear or protest, not the strange stillness Elise held onto now. Vincent pulled the landline phone from the corner of the room and placed it in front of her with a harsh motion, like testing if something would break. "One call," he emphasized. "One." Elise didn't respond to him. She simply picked up the phone and dialed a number. Her breathing remained steady, her voice calm, even as Vincent folded his arms and leaned against the wall, ready to mock her. The line rang once. Then, immediately, a deep, steady male voice answered. "Elise? The meeting's about to start. Where are you?" Elise closed her eyes for a second, exhaled, then opened them. Her voice was soft but clear. "I won't make the 2 o'clock meeting. I've been detained." In the corner, Vincent raised his eyebrows slightly, his face tightening into a cautious expression. He clearly hadn't expected her call to be answered that quickly, or by someone who sounded like that. The man's voice on the other end changed tone instantly. "Detained? For what? Elise, where are you?" Vincent pushed off from the wall, his hand tightening slightly, but he couldn't cut in. Elise kept talking, still calm, still composed. "It's fine," she said, "but you'll want to see something. I think you'll want to reopen a few files." She said it with the tone of someone who had stood in much more intense situations. The man replied immediately, his voice lower now, but heavy with authority. "I'm on my way to the station. Elise, don't say a word until I get there." His breathing was tense, but every word was precise. "Stay on the line for 30 seconds. I'm calling Internal Affairs," Elise answered. "All right. I'm okay." Ever. Vincent listened to the exchange without grasping the full picture, but he could tell something wasn't adding up. He stepped closer to Elise, lowering his voice to try to reassert control. "Who are you talking to?" Elise looked at him calmly, placed the phone back on the table, without hurry. "The office," she said. "I told you that from the start." Vincent exhaled sharply, let out a dry laugh. "A cleaning lady? With an office? That's rich," he said, trying to hide the irritation swelling under his skin. "Your cousin?" Elise tilted her head slightly, her voice softening a note, but carrying more weight. "The person I just called will explain it to you." Just then, the wall-mounted phone in the hallway rang, the sharp bell slicing through the tension and snapping Vincent out of his smug posture. A duty officer answered, listened for a few seconds, his face hardening. He stood straight, then turned toward Vincent. "Hale," he called out, his voice suddenly formal. "The chief wants to see you. Right now." Vincent clicked his tongue but walked out, the door closing behind him. Elise remained seated in the interrogation room. Her wrist still ached, her shoulder throbbed, but her gaze was steady, like a still lake smoothed by wind. She didn't smile, didn't act triumphant. She simply sat there with the quiet resolve of someone who knows that truth doesn't need to shout to exist. She knew the man she had called would never let this go quietly. That man wasn't a mid-level Justice Department employee, wasn't just a lawyer, wasn't a casual contact. He was the United States federal prosecutor for the entire district, the name that appeared at the bottom of the very case files Elise used to sign. Vincent didn't know that yet, but the entire precinct was about to. And from the moment Elise set that phone down, the game had already shifted quietly, but irreversibly. A black car from the Department of Justice pulled up right in front of the station, its tires scraping lightly against the pavement with a sound sharp enough to startle a few nearby officers. While Vincent still believed everything was under control, on another level entirely, the truth had already begun infiltrating the system faster than anyone could react. The video file from Elise's doorbell camera had been transmitted directly to the DOJ's servers, accompanied by a brief description from the initial forwarder. It took only seconds for image recognition software to identify the body cam being shut off. The use of excessive force, and the stark contradiction between the report of resistance and the actual footage showing Elise being dragged, shoved, and slammed without a single act of retaliation. The video opened with a close-up. Vincent reaching for his body cam, looking around, then switching it off. A clean motion, but Elise's porch camera captured it in full. The frame then shifted to him twisting her arm, pinning her to the stone ground. The streak of blood on the steps appeared as vivid red evidence. No narration was needed. The images said everything. At the same time, an anonymous email from Jace was delivered directly to the DOJ's misconduct intake inbox, a channel dedicated to filtering, categorizing, and assessing internal complaints. The attached audio file was shockingly clear. Vincent's voice rang out not by accident, but with the arrogance of someone convinced no one could ever touch him. "All those black folks are the same," he said, his tone dismissive, like retelling an old story. Then came his smug laugh, the scrape of a chair, and a closing line filled with confident breath. "You've got to slam 'em from the start, so they stop pretending." A DOJ analyst opened the file, frowning. 30 seconds later, it was escalated to a superior. 7 minutes after that, the department head issued an order to open an emergency evaluation case. Elise didn't know. Jace didn't know. Vincent, least of all, didn't know. But inside the DOJ, they were well versed in the signs of abuse of power and racial bias. Video plus audio equals a combination no investigation team could ignore. Back at the station, the precinct chief was the first to get a heads-up through the internal network. He watched the video on his computer, his face draining of color with every second that passed. He'd always known Vincent had a temper, had heard the offhand comments, had seen the attitude. When the footage reached the moment Elise was slammed down, her elbow scraping across stone, the blood appearing, The chief pulled his hands off the keyboard, his fingers trembling slightly. He knew that streak of blood would follow them through every stage of the investigation. He rewound to the part where the body cam was turned off. Vincent's every move was so clear, there was no way to explain it as an accident. The glance around, the press of the button, the immediate shift in his voice as he approached Elise. It sent a chill down the chief's spine. This wasn't an internal matter. It was far beyond that. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Vincent was leaning against a desk, voice brimming with confidence, as he chatted with another officer about the report he had just submitted. "I made sure that report's clean," he said, smirking. "If she'd said another word, I would have made it worse." He laughed, a sound that bounced off the walls like evidence building a case against him. He dropped into a chair, chin raised. "Everyone here knows how these things go. I followed protocol." One passing officer paused briefly at that comment, but said nothing. Vincent didn't notice the odd look. He still thought the entire department stood behind him, just like always. Jace walked down the hall, eyes lowered to a file folder to avoid meeting Vincent's gaze. His heart pounded at the sight of how confident Vincent remained. He had just sent off the audio file, unsure how fast the response would come, but certain of one thing: nothing would be the same after this. Minutes later, the internal phone rang inside the precinct chief's office. On the other end was a calm voice, firm as steel. "We'll be arriving in 10 minutes. Please ensure all involved personnel remain on site." It was the voice of the federal chief prosecutor. No title was mentioned, no introduction needed, but anyone in the field knew exactly who that voice belonged to. The chief nodded, throat dry enough that he almost couldn't speak. "Too safe." As he set the phone down, Vincent's voice was still echoing in the hallway, praising himself. He walked past the glass door, strutting like someone who'd just won a battle. He didn't know his assault on Elise had already been magnified across 3 DOJ monitors. He didn't know the audio file from Jace was under review by 3 separate levels. He didn't know who Elise had called, and even less, that the person on the other end was heading directly to the station, at a speed that had the entire system watching. Vincent still thought he had won. But the truth was already surfacing in places he couldn't see quietly, steadily, and with no intention of slowing down. The DOJ wasn't loud, didn't move with noise, but every step they took landed like heavy metal striking lab tile, solid, cold, and irreversible. The first wave was already rising, and Vincent hadn't yet realized it was crashing right behind him. The station chief's office door shut just as the 3 DOJ agents stepped inside, led by the man Elise had called from the interrogation room. He didn't need to introduce himself, didn't need to flash a badge. One look was enough for everyone in the room to understand who was standing in front of them. The station chief sprang to his feet, his face revealing a panic he tried but failed to hide. What had seemed like a normal morning had just turned into a drawn-out nightmare. When the DOJ team pulled up the federal retrieval file, the name Vincent Hale popped up immediately, along with a faint red note, linked to complaint case last year. That led them to dig deeper. It took only a few minutes for a security analyst to pull up an old file, its sealed edges worn, bearing the name of Vincent's father, Samuel Hale, a former police officer in the same county. The file read, "Suspected use of deadly force. Victim, black male, 17 years old." Its dad. In the top right corner were the words, "Investigation suspended. Insufficient evidence." End quote. A short sentence, but clear enough to suggest the case had been shelved in the usual way many cases had been for decades. In the brief incident report, Samuel Hale once said the boy was acting suspicious, verbally aggressive, and potentially dangerous. The exact 3 phrases Vincent had used in his report that morning. The repetition wasn't a coincidence. It looked like a pattern passed down through generations, a warped belief from father to son. Black people are always wrong, police are always right, and every act of violence can be excused with the words, "I felt threatened." A DOJ analyst laid the two reports side by side, the old one from the father and the new one from Vincent. Their structure, tone, and reasoning were over 70% identical. The station chief looked at the papers, paler than the print itself. He knew this wasn't just an individual error. It was a symptom of something systemic. And when the DOJ sees the word systemic, no one is safe. Meanwhile, Elise sat in the interrogation room, listening to the shifting rhythm of footsteps outside. She could tell something bigger was happening. A female agent opened the door, face serious but respectful. "Miss Elise Morgan?" Elise nodded. "Apologies for the delay," the agent said. "Please come with me." "No more questioning?" Elise asked. "No one here has the authority to question you." A simple sentence, but it carried the full weight of a truth that was finally turning back around. As Elise stepped out of the room, the air in the station felt compressed. A few officers lowered their heads, avoiding her gaze. Not because they knew who she was, but because in the past few minutes they had realized the person they arrested that morning wasn't just some black stranger, but one of the most powerful legal figures in the region. Elise kept her face calm, showing neither triumph nor bitterness. She walked like someone who had been through too many hard days, and for whom quiet vindication was enough. At the end of the hallway, Vincent was asked to enter the disciplinary room. He walked in with a sour expression, thinking this was just a quick debrief. He stood with his arms crossed, leaning back slightly as if he owned the room. The station chief stood in front of him, but the voice that spoke belonged to the chief prosecutor. "Do you know who you just arrested?" The question hit like a punch without contact. Vincent opened his mouth to object, but didn't get the chance. The chief prosecutor raised a file and slammed it on the table hard enough to bounce the pages. A screen lit up, with footage from Elise's front porch camera. Freezing on the moment Vincent twisted her arm. "You reported minor resistance," the prosecutor said, voice low and cold. Vincent broke into a sweat down his spine. He glanced at the station chief for support, but the chief didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the floor, like someone who had already seen the worst and didn't want to see any more. "The complaint about you turning off your body cam isn't the first," the director continued. "But this time there's clear evidence. And more importantly," he paused for a beat, "Mrs. Elise Morgan is not just anyone. You just arrested the person in charge of signing off on surveillance and prosecution orders for recent police misconduct cases." His note. Only then did Vincent understand why Elise had said, "You don't know who I am," in such a calm voice. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. All his arrogance collapsed into a black hole. The director ended with a sentence that wasn't loud, but was hard as steel. "Today isn't just a procedural error. This is repeated abuse of power, just like your father." That sentence drained the color from Vincent's face. He had never imagined his family's past would be brought up here, in front of these people. Out in the hallway, Elise stepped through the station's front door. The midday sun still burned, but something in her had shifted. She didn't need to declare victory. She didn't need to look back. She simply walked forward, shoulders straight, each step heavy with calm, light with release. An officer opened the car door to take her home. Elise nodded in thanks, her gaze so peaceful it inspired respect, not pity. She got into the car, hands resting on her lap, face lifted to the long, straight road ahead. In that silence, Elise knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a great wave. And she would be standing at its center not as a victim, but as a witness to the truth. The first battle had turned, and Elise walked out of the station like someone stepping out of darkness, carrying the quiet strength of someone who knows they will never back down. News that Elise had left the station under the protection of the Department of Justice spread so quickly that by the time the car turned into Bellevue Ridge, the entire neighborhood was already buzzing like a stirred-up ant nest. Just a few hours later, local news sites were posting headlines like, "Racist officer wrongfully arrests high-ranking official." Short words, but strong enough to shake loose layers of long-standing frustration. Black residents in the area began sharing online the times they had been pulled over right in front of their homes. Comments flooded in with stories of being asked, "Do you live here? Can I see your ID? You don't look like someone from this neighborhood," as if everyone had just been waiting for this moment to finally speak up about what they'd endured for years. One middle-aged black man said he had been stopped 3 times in 1 week, even though he lived only 2 houses down from where Elise was arrested. A young mother said her 16-year-old son was questioned every time he walked home from basketball practice. These stories suddenly surfaced all at once, like wind whipping across the surface of water, revealing the truth that Elise was not an isolated case. She was simply the first person the system couldn't bury so easily. Across Bellevue Ridge, in the poorer white section, families who lived on the edge of the wealthy enclave but weren't truly part of the upper class, people reacted differently. A blonde woman with a high ponytail stood outside a grocery store, whispering to her friend, voice trembling, "If they can do that to her, people like us don't stand a chance." A plumber told his coworker that Vincent had once yelled at him like a criminal just for parking the wrong way. These were people who had always thought the police only went after black folks. But Elise's case made them realize the truth was more twisted. When an officer believes power belongs to him, anyone poorer, weaker, or not fitting his mold becomes a target. Holding their phones, reading the news, everyone in the neighborhood sighed in their own way. Black residents sighed from the pain of old wounds being reopened. Poor white residents sighed from the fear that their future could be crushed, just as Elise's nearly was. The wealthy sighed because they didn't want their neighborhood's reputation dragged through the mud. But regardless of motive, the outrage spread like fire meeting dry grass. Online comments exploded. Neighborhood groups shared footage from the camera across the street from Elise's home. The image of a bloodstain trailing down the steps became a stark symbol of injustice. One post read, "If she hadn't survived that morning, who would have been held accountable?" And it was shared thousands of times in just 30 minutes. By the afternoon, a few reporters had gathered outside the Bellevue Ridge gates. An older black man stood near them, eyes fixed on the rows of trees lining the road, speaking almost to himself. "I've lived here 12 years and never been seen as a real resident." A cameraman captured that line, and it became the lead quote in the evening news. In the backyard of one house, 2 white women whispered, "They're going to investigate the whole station. I heard his father had something like this in the past, too." Secrets, the neighborhood thought, were long buried began to rise again. Not clearly, but enough to send chills down many spines. In the middle of it all, Elise stayed inside her home, sitting on a chair near the window, the afternoon light slowly fading across the floor. Her phone rang non-stop calls from reporters, acquaintances, colleagues, and strangers wanting to hear her story. But Elise didn't answer. She read a few headlines, turned off the screen, and set the phone down. She didn't rage online, didn't issue statements, didn't appear on camera to recount what had happened. She let things unfold as they would, because she understood one simple truth, heavy as stone. When the facts are fully visible, they don't need the victim to scream to be seen. A light breeze slipped through the crack in the door, carrying with it the distant sound of a crowd beginning to gather outside the neighborhood gate. Elise touched the bandage around her elbow, felt the fading pain beneath, then closed her eyes not to escape the news or hide from the attention, but to calm her mind amid the rising storm outside. The public was outraged, The neighborhood was buzzing. The police station was shaking. But Elise chose silence, because she knew her role would come later, after the fury passed, and the truth needed the voice of a witness. In that moment, the community's anger surged by the minute, spreading from a few homes to the entire neighborhood and beyond, out into the county. But inside house number 28, Elise sat quietly, like the still center of a whirlwind, letting the truth grow into a force too powerful to ever be buried again. Vincent stepped out of the disciplinary room like a man who had lost his footing but was still clinging to his usual aggression. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialed a sequence of numbers, and headed straight to the back parking lot where no one else was around. He spoke loudly, his voice full of rage. "I was set up. I need you here now. Bring your analysis files." On the other end of the line was a well-known white attorney, famous for winning cases using counter-attack tactics, the same lawyer who had defended several scandal-ridden officers in the past. Vincent spoke quickly, trying to paint himself as a victim of the system. His voice cracking, like he was trying to prove he was the one being wronged. Just 1 hour later, Vincent's lawyer arrived, carrying a thick briefcase and the kind of confidence only someone used to bending the rules could have. He sat across from Vincent in a small meeting room, opened the file, and said straight away, "We'll say she resisted. The camera didn't capture the full situation. I'll spin it to show you followed the procedure. You just need to stick to your statement." Vincent nodded like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline, clinging to every word. But when the video from Elise's porch camera played in the room, the lawyer's face turned cold for a few seconds. The footage of Vincent turning off his body cam appeared clearly. The lawyer cleared his throat and deflected. "Maybe we can argue it was an accidental press." But the next part, him twisting Elise's arm, dragging her down, his voice shouting, "You're resisting," even though she lay motionless, stopped the lawyer mid-sentence. His expression changed, the confidence replaced by caution. "And this audio file," said the DOJ representative, placing a phone on the table. Vincent's voice rang out crystal clear. "They're all the same. These people of color gotta press hard from the start." His laugh echoed in the recording, making even him go pale. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, lips pressed tight, trying to keep his composure. But Vincent instantly understood the problem. The man he was counting on no longer saw him as someone worth defending. Vincent gripped the edge of the table, voice rising. "You have to help me. They're setting me up." The lawyer adjusted his tie, then spoke low but firm. "They don't need to set you up. You did it all yourself." Vincent's face twisted, his throat locked. But before he could say another word, the meeting room door swung open. Morrison walked in, his patrol partner from that morning. He wasn't the confrontational type, but he was done watching the truth get distorted. Morrison stood straight, looked at Vincent, then turned to the investigators. "I want to add to my statement," he said. "I saw Hale turn off his body cam. I warned him, but he ignored me." Unquote. The words dropped like a heavy stone in the middle of the room. Vincent looked at Morrison, eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe the teammate he'd worked with for years was now on the other side. "What are you doing?" Vincent growled. Morrison didn't look back at him. He continued, "I saw him pull her down when she wasn't doing anything." The lawyer looked at Vincent with a chilling gaze. "I can't counter that testimony," he said, then closed his briefcase, the motion quick and heavy. "I suggest you prepare for the worst." In that briefest of moments, Vincent felt the last rope he'd been clinging to snap away. A female officer tapped lightly at the door, announcing, "The district attorney wants to see you, right now." Her voice was neutral, but she couldn't hide the distance meant for someone who had just lost everything. Vincent entered the room, trying to keep his posture upright. But each step felt like lead. The district attorney looked at him like a case already concluded. "Mr. Hale," he said, his tone sharp, without needing to be loud. All evidence shows you abused your authority, used unnecessary force, disabled recording equipment, and submitted a false report. But the worst part, he tilted his head, eyes cold as ice. You thought you could get away with it. Vincent swallowed hard, lips dry. I was set up. But the words came out so weak that even he could hear the desperation in them. No one set you up, the DA replied. You did it to yourself. Then he placed a printout of the video in front of Vincent. You think the DOJ will overlook this? Vincent looked down at the paper, where the still frame of him dragging Elise down was captured in perfect clarity, as if someone had taken the photo right in front of his face. That image made him feel more exposed than ever before. As he stepped out of the room, the hallway felt endless, like each step carried him deeper into a space where every door slammed shut behind him. A few officers avoided his gaze. Others looked at him with unmistakable coldness. Vincent understood. He was no longer the tough Hale they once feared. He was just a man who had been laid bare. Outside the station, Elise had already been taken home. The black car pulled up in front of her house, and she stepped out slowly. Her eyes were calm, not triumphant, not angry, just a mix of fatigue and a kind of pride that was hard to describe. She passed the front steps where the old bloodstain had dried, gently touched the doorframe, then walked inside like someone who had already won and didn't need to announce it. While Vincent began to unravel, Elise entered her home with the quiet of someone who knew that the truth always speaks in the end, and that voice was now growing louder across the entire story. The next morning, Elise stepped into a private DOJ meeting room. Not large but solemn, with the weight of decisions that could shape people's futures. On the table was a file containing everything that had happened the day before, along with footage from 3 different cameras. Elise sat down, resting her hand lightly on the table, her expression calm but deep enough that everyone in the room immediately understood. This was not a victim waiting to be protected, but someone well accustomed to facing the truth head-on. The lead of the session spoke first, asking where she would like to begin. Elise responded immediately, I want this case handled strictly by the law. No favors for me. No leniency for anyone. Ebel, a DOJ attorney sitting beside her, leaned in, ready to say what many were probably thinking. He didn't realize you were. But Elise gently raised her hand to interrupt, neither abrupt nor forceful, just clear enough for the whole room to understand. She did not want to go down that path. I want the truth to speak first, she said. If we start with my position, people will think I'm using my power to intimidate. Her words silenced the room for a few seconds. A distant agent leaned back in his chair and gave a small nod, as if he had just seen something he genuinely respected. An investigator opened a laptop and played the footage from Elise's front porch. The image was so sharp that Vincent's every move cut like a blade. Elise watched the screen without flinching, without frowning, and without trembling when the moment showed her being slammed onto the stone floor. She viewed the footage with the clarity of someone trained to analyze evidence, keeping emotion from distorting the facts. When the video ended, Elise said, Check the neighbor's camera too, across the street. I want to prove everything started the moment Mrs. Meredith called 911, not when Vincent arrived. An agent pulled up the footage from the neighbor's camera, already been submitted. It included a clip of Meredith standing with her arms crossed, speaking in a tone Elise couldn't hear yesterday, but the camera had captured it clearly. I knew it, someone like that doesn't belong here. Elise looked down at the table, took a slow breath, then lifted her head. There was no anger, no bitterness, only the recognition of a truth so familiar it hurt. This isn't just about me, she said. This is about how they see everyone who looks like me. It's, end quote. Another lawyer asked, What do you want to present first in court? Elise sat up straight. eyes focused as if preparing for a major trial. "I want the evidence presented in exact chronological order," she replied. "Start with the 911 call, then the neighbor's camera, then the front porch footage, and finally, Officer Jace's audio recording." One attorney nodded and took notes. Elise continued, "I don't want anything edited to work in my favor. If I wanted to win with my position, this would have ended yesterday. I want to win with the truth." The room fell silent again at those words. Not a tense silence, but one filled with respect. A female agent spoke up. "Who would you like us to call in?" Elise looked straight at the screen, where Vincent's face was frozen in a frame mid-shout. "Everyone," she said. "The person who made the 911 call, the one who filmed the video, Officer Jace, and Morrison. So people can see one thing. I'm not just standing for myself." An older agent looked at Elise for a moment, then asked, "Why do you have to make things so hard on yourself?" Elise tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but clear. "Because so many others don't have a voice. But I do." The people in the room glanced at each other, but no one said anything more. Elise looked down at the file in front of her, turning each page with a steady hand, as if she were reviewing someone else's case, not her own. That calm wasn't an act, it was something forged over a lifetime of facing injustice. Elise knew she held a unique position. She was a judge. She had power. But she chose not to use that power in the way people expected. She didn't want yesterday's storm to become her personal story. She wanted it to open a door that so many others hadn't had the strength to push open. The meeting stretched on for another hour before it ended. As Elise stepped into the hallway, a few DOJ staff instinctively moved aside in a gesture of respect. Elise didn't pay it any attention. She walked slowly and steadily. Her posture, not that of someone who had been humiliated less than 24 hours earlier, but of someone preparing to walk into the most important trial of her life. Stepping out of the building, Elise lifted her face to the evening breeze, her eyes steady, but not proud. She didn't emerge like someone seeking the spotlight, but like someone entering a new battle, with both humility and strength. She knew she was about to stand in court, carrying on her shoulders both the role of victim and bearer of responsibility. Not the responsibility to prove her own innocence, but the responsibility to prove something that so many before her never had the chance to say. Our truth deserves to be seen. As Elise stepped down the stairs, a light wind lifted the edge of her coat. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh. She kept the calm expression of someone who understood that truth doesn't need to be loud to be strong. And those who carry it don't need noise to matter. She walked toward the waiting car, ready for the next step. That quiet dignity, in the face of the biggest confrontation of her life, was the very thing that made everyone in that meeting room earlier look at her again, this time with different eyes. That afternoon, when Elise returned home from the private DOJ meeting, she planned to take a few moments to breathe, to let her mind settle before preparing for the upcoming trial. But as soon as she stepped through the gate, a federal courier was already waiting at the end of the walkway, holding a black envelope, the kind only certain agencies used in exceptional cases. There was no sender's name on the envelope, only a federal seal and a string of encrypted digits. Elise signed for it, then stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her, cutting off the noise outside, leaving behind a dense silence. She placed the envelope on the living room table, her fingers brushing over the matte black surface, as if sensing something heavier than what the envelope physically held. Elise ran her finger along the sealed edge, opening it slowly, not out of fear, but because she knew documents of this nature were rarely simple. Inside was a single hard black card, with only one line printed in white. Project Rise. Phase 3. Deployment. No explanation, no instructions, just that phrase, stark and cold, as a blade striking stone. Elise tilted her head, eyes resting on the words Phase 3 for a long while. Any project reaching Phase 3 had usually passed through layers of review and internal clearance. The word deployment made her feel the presence of something larger, something systemic. This was not just a response to her case. Beneath the phrase was a small QR code, printed in a type of ink only visible under direct light at the right angle. Elise held up her phone to scan it. The screen lit up. A simple interface appeared, no logo, no agency name, just a wide map of the United States, covered with hundreds of small, blinking red dots. She zoomed in. In every state, at least 3 dots appeared. Some had 5, 7, even a dozen. Elise focused on the South and recognized a familiar pattern. Most dots clustered in counties with known histories of racial tension and police misconduct. Some overlapped with cases she'd heard of before, ones dismissed for lack of evidence. Others were in places no one paid attention to, where residents were too poor to hire lawyers or too exhausted to file complaints. Elise leaned back in her chair, phone in hand, but eyes looking far beyond the screen. Those red dots didn't just represent cases like hers. They marked a long-running system, something everyone had a sense of, but few had seen in full. A machine not built by any single person, and one that couldn't be dismantled by a single report or courtroom verdict. The red dots pulsed like the heartbeat of an old disease, spread across the body of the nation. A small notification appeared in the corner of the screen. Case flag. Similar pattern detected. Elise tapped it. A subfolder opened, listing case summaries. Body cam turned off before intervention. Report inconsistent with video evidence. Victim labeled suspicious based on skin color. False alarm from neighbor. Elise read each line, each one feeling like a mirrored version of her own experience. She set the phone down, her fingers clasped in silence, her mind piecing together things she had only ever seen as fragments. She remembered the face of the black teenager killed by Vincent's father in the old case file. She remembered past trials, scattered testimonies, tired victims. Now everything was coming together into a larger picture. The injustice wasn't confined to Bellevue Ridge, wasn't just about her. It was a nationwide pattern. Elise stood and walked to the window. The evening light was softer than the day before. A gentle gold, without the harsh glare that had slammed her to the porch. She rested her hand on the window frame and took a deep breath. Not out of despair or rage, but from a widening awareness, like a dark room being cracked open to reveal the full view. Her phone pinged once more. A final message appeared on the screen. This is not an isolated incident. Elise repeated the phrase quietly to herself, voice low, like a confirmation. She had known it for a long time, but seeing it written there, with that map glowing red, made the awareness sharper and more defined than ever before. She turned off the screen, placed the envelope back on the table, her gaze lowering like someone preparing for a larger decision. Not a decision to retaliate against Vincent, not a decision to speak to the press, but a decision to step into a higher level of battle, the fight against the system itself. As she sat down, back straight, hands resting on the table, Elise's face showed no trace of shock or fear. She took it all in with the composure of someone who understood. She was standing in front of a far-reaching picture, and that her part in it was just beginning. The red dots on the map didn't frighten her. They made the road ahead feel heavier, but also made her role feel undeniably real. Elise gently closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, calm and determination were written clearly across her gaze. She knew the system was waking up, and she knew she had stepped into the center of that movement, not with noise, not with titles, but as someone who had always understood. This journey was never meant to be walked alone. The night before the trial, All of Bellevue Ridge seemed to hold its breath at once. Every house kept its lights on later than usual, as if everyone was trying to stay awake to witness what would unfold the next morning. In a temporary apartment arranged by the police department, Vincent sat on the edge of his bed, head in hands, eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless nights. Since his suspension, he'd been required to meet with a psychologist. But each session only made him more tense, filled with questions about feelings, motives, and behavior. He hated the feeling of being dissected. He was used to controlling others, giving orders, and forcing people down onto the pavement without a second thought. Now, every night he jolted awake, hearing Elise's voice echo, "You're making a mistake," hearing the sound of rubber chairs in the interrogation room hitting the wall, hearing the station chief ask the one question he couldn't answer. Did you know who she was? At the police station, the atmosphere was heavy as lead. The usual banter, coffee runs, and football chatter had vanished. People avoided eye contact. Everyone feared the investigation might reach them. Officers who had patrolled with Vincent now wondered if there had ever been times they missed him turning off his body cam, or if his racist jokes had been overheard. Jace walked through the hallway and felt a few colleagues glance away. Not because they thought he'd betrayed anyone, but because they feared he knew more than he had said. He kept his head down, focused on the file in his hands, but his heart pounded when he heard whispers behind him. They might review this whole station. Another voice replied, "It only takes one to bring everyone down." No one said Vincent's name, but everyone was thinking it. Across the neighborhood, Meredith curled up in her spacious bedroom, the soft yellow light casting shadows on the ceiling. The subpoena sat on her vanity. When she received it, Meredith had tried to act calm, telling her husband, "It's nothing. I'll just tell the truth." But the moment he left the room, her face turned pale. She read every line again. The requirement to appear in court, to give testimony under oath, and the warning that false statements may lead to criminal prosecution. She remembered Elise's face pinned against the steps, the way Vincent shouted loud enough for the entire street to hear. And then she remembered what she herself had said that day. "I knew it. Someone like that doesn't belong here." That sentence now echoed in her mind like a gavel strike, hammering at the false confidence she had wrapped around herself for years. Meredith turned over and over in bed, pulling the blanket up, then kicking it off. But the fear didn't leave. She had never imagined that a call she made, thinking it was for neighborhood safety, would end with her being called to answer in court. While the city tossed and turned with all kinds of worry, Elise sat alone in the reading room of house number 28. The soft yellow light reflected on the window glass, but she wasn't looking outside. On the table lay the shirt she had worn on the day of her arrest. She laid it out flat, smoothing the edges with both hands, then her eyes rested on the dried bloodstain near the elbow, a thin, dark brown streak, like a signature from that unforgettable morning. Elise touched it lightly with her fingertip. The coarse texture of the torn fabric made her chest tighten. She wasn't someone who often showed emotion, but the bloodstain didn't just remind her of physical pain. It reminded her of what so many others had endured without cameras, without witnesses, without the DOJ stepping in. She sat like that for a long time, letting her mind retrace every step of what had happened. Not with regret or fear, but to prepare. Elise knew that tomorrow she wouldn't walk into court as a judge, but as someone who had been humiliated on her own doorstep, in front of her neighbors, under the midday sun, by an officer who didn't see her as a person. She knew that what she said in court wouldn't just be entered into the record. It would travel, reaching families who had lived through the same but stayed silent out of fear. Elise placed the shirt back on the table, clasped her hands together, and closed her eyes for a moment. Behind her eyelids, she saw red dots scattered across a map. Not warnings, but untold stories. She opened her eyes slowly and steadily. like someone who had walked a road full of stones and was now ready to climb the final slope. "Elise Morgan," she whispered to herself, "tomorrow you must speak the truth. Not to get back at Vincent, not to prove her innocence, but so those without a voice can hear their truth in hers." On a night when the whole city was restless, only Elise's reading room stayed quiet in a strange, solemn way. Quiet. Not from a lack of tension, but because she had put her heart exactly where it needed to be, at the line between justice and lived experience. She stood, turned off the light, and stepped out with a gentle footfall, carrying a vow no one had heard, but tomorrow the entire courtroom would feel it. That morning, the courtroom was so packed that extra chairs had to be placed along both walls, and even then, some people were left standing, leaning against the old wooden door frame worn down by time. The air in the room, already small, felt compressed. The cold, white fluorescent lights cast down on tense faces, as if each had been coated in a thin layer of plaster. It wasn't because this case had started as a major trial, but because everyone there understood that this hearing wasn't just about Vincent Hale and Elise Morgan. It was about something that had simmered beneath Bellevue Ridge for years, something everyone knew existed, but had avoided like a hairline crack. They hoped a few coats of paint could hide. Today, that crack had widened into a deep fault, and everyone was forced to face it. The courtroom felt so heavy that even breathing seemed slower, each breath searching for space to squeeze through. Elise walked in wearing a muted suit. No bold colors, no display of authority like in the days she sat on the bench. Her posture was straight, her steps steady, as if each one was a quiet reminder to herself to stay centered in a room full of eyes. She took her seat in the witness chair, the same seat where she had seen countless others while she held the scales of justice. Now, the scene had flipped, and though no one said a word, everyone felt a subtle but very real shift in that moment. There were no media cameras in the room, only DOJ representatives, attorneys from both sides, a temporary jury, and a community holding its collective breath. The prosecutor stood first, placed a laptop on the worn wooden podium, and connected it to the large screen behind. The soft click of the cable being plugged in echoed through the silence, a tiny sound that on any other day would go unnoticed, but today felt like the trigger of something long overdue. We present Exhibit 1. The video from Elise's porch camera lit up the screen, the image slightly trembling from the morning wind. No voiceover, no cuts, no effects. Just raw reality. Vincent walking up, glancing around quickly with the practiced habit of someone used to power, then reaching up and switching off his body cam like it was second nature. Done without thought. The video cut to the moment he grabbed Elise's arm, twisted it hard, and slammed her onto the stone. The impact sound was missing. The video silent, but everyone in the room could imagine it. A streak of blood appeared clearly in the center of the screen, bright red and cold like an exclamation mark at the end of a sentence he had assumed no one would ever read. When that blood streak appeared, no one in the courtroom made a sound. No chair shifted. No one cleared their throat. A woman in the back instinctively raised a hand to her mouth. An older man shook his head, eyes red but trying to stay composed. Elise stared straight at the screen, her eyes steady, not flinching, not turning away, as if she had promised herself that if the truth existed, she would face it directly. When the footage cut to Vincent shouting, resisting, while Elise lay motionless, a quiet sigh came from the jury box, light but sharp, like the sound of glass cracking in a room already stretched too thin. The prosecutor moved to Exhibit 2, the neighbor's camera footage. The screen lit up again, and Meredith appeared in the left corner, arms crossed, her face twisted in displeasure. Her eyes were hard, jaw clenched, as if Elise's presence in the neighborhood was a personal offense. Her voice rang out, clear as metal striking metal. "I knew it, someone like that doesn't belong here." No one in the room needed that statement. explained. It said everything about the pattern that morning, a pattern many knew, but few dared say out loud. The air grew heavier, as if everyone suddenly realized they were hearing something they had long chosen to ignore. A poor white man sitting at the back lowered his head and whispered, "If they can do that to her, what chance do people like us have?" The words weren't aimed at anyone, yet they struck a chord that echoed across the room. The prosecutor played Exhibit 3, Jace's audio recording. Vincent's voice came through confident, unguarded, like someone so used to winning he didn't bother hiding anymore. "Black folks are all the same. You gotta pressure them from the start." Each word landed like a heavy stone dropped into what had seemed like still water. On the left side of the room, Vincent stared down at the table. His fingers were clasped tightly, knuckles pale, like a man trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. His lawyer leaned slightly back, shoulders slumped. He understood the situation too well, and the confidence he'd shown the day before was gone, replaced by the quiet surrender of a white flag raised in a hopeless battle. When the prosecution finished presenting, the presiding judge called Elise to the stand. She placed her hand on the wooden rail, bowed her head slightly as protocol required, then stood upright, her eyes focused on the questioner. Not trembling, not cold, just steady. Unmistakably so. The prosecutor asked, "Did you resist or act aggressively that morning?" Elise looked straight ahead, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "I did not resist. I simply existed." Half the courtroom shuddered, not because the sentence was long or complex, but because its weight came from how simple it was. The jurors glanced at each other. No one dared to blink. The prosecutor continued, "Did you say anything that could have made Officer Hale believe you were a threat?" Elise replied, "I said this was my house. That's all." The answer was short, but it hit harder than any carefully rehearsed speech ever could. When it was Vincent's turn to be questioned, he stepped onto the stand with a trembling posture. Nothing like the aggressive man from the video. His steps lacked confidence. His shoulders slouched, no longer the stance of someone used to giving orders. The prosecutor approached, voice low but cold as steel. "Mr. Hale, on what basis did you assume Mrs. Morgan didn't live in that home?" Vincent opened his mouth but found no answer. He swallowed hard, eyes lowered, like someone trying to recover a lost excuse. I thought." "You thought based on what? Her skin color?" The prosecutor cut in, the question acting like a mirror held to the very truth he was trying to avoid. Vincent tried to speak again, but his voice caught in his throat. No one in the room believed anything he might have said next. His face flushed red, then turned pale in seconds. His hands shook so badly he had to grip the wooden railing to keep from stepping back. When the questioning ended, the judge conferred briefly with the two DOJ representatives. The entire courtroom held its breath. Then, the gavel struck. "This court hereby orders a federal criminal investigation into Officer Vincent Hale, on charges including abuse of power, falsifying reports, and actions motivated by racial bias." The courtroom fell completely silent. No clapping, no cheering. Only the heavy stillness of a lake after the wind has died. Elise stood still, eyes resting on the paper in front of her. Not joyful, not vengeful, just the quiet exhale of someone who had seen justice move one step closer. As she stepped down from the stand, Elise passed by Vincent. He didn't dare look at her. She didn't pause. She simply walked on calm and light, but forged solid like steel, tempered in fire. The courtroom watched her not as someone who had won, but as someone who had stood her ground. Even though the trial had ended, Elise knew this was only the beginning. The red dots on the map, the buried stories, the years of fear wouldn't disappear with one ruling. But today, truth had prevailed. And Elise, with each step away from the courtroom, carried the knowledge that the next battle was waiting not just for her, but for all those who had never been allowed to say, "I simply existed." Right after the trial, Bellevue Ridge was no longer the quiet neighborhood it had always been. Curtains that were usually shut tight now shifted constantly, with residents peeking out to the street sometimes to avoid reporters' cameras, sometimes pressing close to the fence just to catch a bit of news. The DOJ officially issued a mandate for a complete overhaul of the Bellevue Police Department. It wasn't a polite recommendation. It was a stamped document listing detailed terms. A full review of all arrest procedures, mandatory body cam use throughout entire shifts, the formation of an independent civilian oversight board, and a re-examination of every closed case from the past 20 years. The station chief read that document in his office, hands trembling slightly, then sank into his chair like someone staring at a storm he had no idea when or if it would end. The news spread like wind tearing through dry leaves. People who had once been victims of Vincent, or had been threatened by him before, started filing complaints. A black man in his 40s told an attorney that Vincent had once stopped him in front of his daughter's school just because he thought a car that nice couldn't belong to him. A young woman recounted how Vincent had searched her purse at the grocery store, found nothing, and still said, "You look like you're hiding something." The complaints came in so fast that the law office had to set up a separate hotline just to handle intake. Vincent's life was no longer a single incident. It had become the entry point to a flood of long-suppressed grievances the town had carried in silence. As for Meredith, the woman who had called 911, that fateful morning, she could no longer step outside without meeting the cold stares of her neighbors. A curly-haired woman standing outside a supermarket said directly to her face, "You put people in danger with your prejudice." An older man said nothing, just shook his head, his eyes silently asking, "How do you still sleep at night?" Her son had to pick her up from the end of the street to avoid the press. She tried explaining that she had just thought there was a stranger, but no one was listening anymore. The neighbor's video had captured her words, her expression, and that truth left no room for, "I made a mistake." Social media didn't spare her either. Under the article, quoting her testimony, hundreds of angry comments piled up. One read, "If Elise hadn't held a powerful position, she might be dead right now." Meredith read it and closed the screen, but the words clung to her mind like metal scraping against stone. While the entire town was in turmoil, Elise returned to house number 28 in the late afternoon. The light was softer, the street quieter than the day she was arrested, but the porch steps hadn't changed. The dried bloodstain had faded, but its outline remained clear enough that Elise paused for a few seconds. She didn't touch it. She didn't look away, either. Elise simply stood there, looking down at the stone step where her body had been forced down, where Vincent had gripped her arm like she was an object without feeling. Then she exhaled deeply and took a single step forward. There was no music, no one is filming, just the sound of Elise's shoes tapping lightly on the step. A simple motion, yet as heavy as stepping through her own past. She stepped onto the second step, then the third. Each step was steady, calm, without hesitation or fear. She opened her door with the same entry code Vincent hadn't given her a chance to type in that day. As the door opened, Elise turned her head for one last look, not to remember but to confirm she had passed through it, whole and stronger than before. From a distance, a few neighbors watched. Some looked on with sympathy, some with respect, and some with regret. Elise didn't stop to read their expressions. She simply stepped inside, closed the door, and in that moment, something in the air shifted, as if the house, the steps, and the entire neighborhood understood they had just witnessed a woman rise from something that was meant to break her. Outside, the murmurs continued. The DOJ kept sending notices. Complaints kept piling up. The entire system was shaking in a way few had ever seen. But inside Elise's home, for the first time in days, the silence was so complete she could hear the wall clock ticking, one beat at a time. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew she had walked through the hardest door, the one between pain and truth. And where she stood now was no longer the place of a victim, but the place of someone ready to keep walking forward. The morning after the trial, Elise sat in her small study, the desk still scattered with documents the DOJ had sent the day before. Her phone vibrated. The screen showed the number of the Federal Department of Justice. She answered, and heard the voice of a familiar special envoy, someone who had worked with her on several major cases. He got straight to the point. "Mrs. Elise Morgan, we would like to invite you to join a new federal special task force. The group will directly handle police misconduct cases nationwide." He paused briefly, then added, "You know the system is shaking. We need people like you, people who understand both the law and the reality." Elise didn't respond immediately. She looked out the window, morning light pressing faintly against the glass. She spoke softly, "I don't want to turn my case into a stepping stone." The voice on the other end replied without hesitation, "We're not inviting you because of your case. We're inviting you because you know what happens when truth gets squeezed into silence." Elise paused for a few seconds, then nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'm in." A few minutes later, an encrypted email arrived in her private inbox. The file icon appeared as a black folder, labeled with a single line, "Rise, National Pattern Detected." Elise opened it and entered her verification code. The screen shifted to the signature interface of the Federal Analytics System. A map of the United States appeared this time sharper than the one she had seen inside the black envelope days earlier. Red dots began to pulse rhythmically, not dozens, but hundreds. Elise zoomed in on each region. The southeast was dense, the plains were sparse but growing fast. The west had many and small towns, places that rarely made headlines. Every red dot represented a case with a pattern matching Elise's. Body cams turned off, false reports filed, unnecessary force used, suspicion based on skin color, neighbors calling 911 out of bias. A small note flashed. Patterns escalating, multiple states cross-referencing. Elise leaned back in her chair, both hands resting on the table, her body feeling heavier as she stared at the map. It wasn't fear, just the sheer scale of it all. What she had been through was only one dot in a sea of flashing points. If the term "the system" had ever felt abstract, it was now visible before her eyes, each red dot like a misfiring heartbeat in the body of the nation. She scrolled to the next note. A text file opened, listing the states marked for urgent investigation. Among them were places Elise had worked during the early years of her career, towns where she had once reviewed cases that were quietly shelved. Looking at the list, Elise saw one truth clearly. The country had reached a crossroads, keep turning a blind eye, or look directly at what was breaking open in front of them. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from the envoy. "When you're ready, we'd like to begin the kickoff meeting. There will be representatives from 3 federal departments." Elise set the phone down without replying right away. She stood up, walked out of the study, and made her way down the hallway with slow, steady steps. The house was quiet, but a quiet that felt like the start of something, not the end. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Morning light stretched across the steps like a thin cloth. Elise looked down at the spot where the dried blood had once been. The stone had been cleaned, but the image of that day remained sharp in her memory. She didn't avoid it. She didn't hold on to it either. Elise simply looked at it the way one looks at a page that has already been read. Then she took a deep breath and lifted her gaze to the road stretching out in front of the house, a road she used to walk as an ordinary resident. But today, She stood like someone preparing to enter a much wider battlefield. There was no grand speech, no flashing cameras, just Elise standing there, one hand lightly resting on the porch railing, her eyes looking past the house, past Bellevue Ridge, beyond anything she had ever imagined she would face. She whispered, just loud enough to hear herself, "The story isn't over." She turned back inside and gently closed the door. In that moment, something in the air shifted, as if something was moving in step with her. Elise was no longer the woman slammed onto the steps, no longer just a witness, no longer only a judge. She had become a key piece in a new fight where every red dot on the map would need light cast deep into its roots. Somewhere within the system, people were waiting for her. Somewhere else, more stories were catching fire. Elise stepped into that path, not to seek revenge, but to make sure what happened to her and to hundreds of others would never again be rewritten by a false report. The new battle began right there on that front porch, with the unwavering gaze of Elise Morgan. In Elise Morgan's story, we see not just a single morning of injustice, but an entire system that allowed such moments to happen again and again. Elise is a victim, but she is also a mirror reflecting the experiences of thousands of others, people who have been doubted, mistreated, and defined not by their character or dignity, but by the color of their skin. What Vincent did was not a sudden impulse. It was the product of years of nurtured prejudice, of outdated patterns society still refuses to let go. And that is what makes this story far bigger than Elise alone. The first lesson is that silence never protects anyone. Elise was humiliated right at her own doorstep, but she didn't let that pain turn into fear. She stood up, told the truth clearly, and let the evidence speak. If she had stayed silent, this would have been just another case quietly buried, like so many others. But she chose to confront it. That courage opened the door for others who had suffered in silence to come forward and share their own stories. The second lesson: prejudice, even when dressed as protecting the community, always leads to serious consequences. Meredith thought she was helping the neighborhood, but in reality, she helped push an innocent person into danger. And that's something each of us must ask ourselves. How many times have we judged someone before we truly knew who they were? How many times has a phone call, a comment, or even a glance caused pain we never even saw? The final lesson: justice doesn't always start in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with an ordinary person who dares to say, "Enough." No matter who you are or where you stand, your voice has value. Elise proved that. And the system was forced to change because one truth was too clear to bury again. If this story made you think, share it so more people can learn from it. Society only gets better when each of us dares to reflect, to admit, and to change. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. I'm committed to bringing you the most powerful content stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that bring lasting value to our communities.